An Atlantic hurricane. A tropical storm is a tropical cyclone that forms in the Atlantic Ocean, usually in the summer or fall. Tropical cyclones can be categorized by intensity. Tropical storms have 1-minute maximum sustained winds of at least 39 miles per hour, while hurricanes have 1-minute maximum sustained winds exceeding 74 miles per hour. Most North Atlantic tropical storms and hurricanes form between June 1 and November 30. The United States National Hurricane Center monitors the basin and issues reports, watches, and warnings about tropical weather systems for the North Atlantic Basin as one of the regional specialized meteorological centers for tropical cyclones, as defined by the World Meteorological Organization. In recent times, tropical disturbances that reach tropical storm intensity are named from a predetermined list. Hurricanes that result in significant damage or casualties may have their names retired from the list at the request of the affected nations in order to prevent confusion should a subsequent storm be given the same name. On average, in the North Atlantic Basin 11.3 named storms occur each season, with an average of 6.2 becoming hurricanes and 2.3 becoming major hurricanes. The climatological peak of activity is around September 11 each season. In March 2004, Katrina was the first hurricane-intensity tropical cyclone ever recorded in the southern Atlantic Ocean. Since 2011, the Brazilian Navy Hydrographic Center has started to use the same scale of the North Atlantic Ocean for tropical cyclones in the South Atlantic Ocean and assign names to those which reach 35 knots. Steering factors. Tropical cyclones are steered by the surrounding flow throughout the depth of the troposphere. High. Neil Frank, a former director of the United States National Hurricane Center, used the analogies such as a leaf carried along in a stream or a brick moving through a river of air to describe the way atmospheric flow affects the path of a hurricane across the ocean, specifically airflow around high-pressure systems and toward low-pressure areas influence hurricane tracks. In the tropical latitudes, tropical storms and hurricanes generally move westward with a slight turn toward the north. Under the influence of the subtropical ridge, a high-pressure system that usually extends east-west across the subtropics. South of the subtropical ridge, surface easterly winds prevail. If the subtropical ridge is weakened by an upper trough, a tropical cyclone may turn poleward and then recurve, or curve back toward the northeast into the main belt of the westerlies. Poleward of the subtropical ridge, westerly winds prevail and generally steer tropical cyclones that reach northern latitudes toward the east. The westerlies also steer extratropical cyclones with the cold and warm fronts from west to east. Intensity. Generally speaking, the intensity of a tropical cyclone is determined by either the storm's maximum sustained winds or lowest barometric pressure. The following table lists the most intense Atlantic hurricanes in terms of the lowest barometric pressure. In terms of wind speed, Hurricane Allen was the strongest Atlantic tropical cyclone on record, with maximum sustained winds of 190 miles per hour. However, these measurements are suspect since instrumentation used to document wind speeds at the time would likely succumb to winds of such intensity. Nonetheless, the central pressures are low enough to rank them among the strongest recorded Atlantic hurricanes. Owing to their intensity, the strongest Atlantic hurricanes have all attained Category 5 classification. Hurricane Opal, the strongest Category 4 hurricane recorded, intensified to reach a minimum pressure of 916 millibars, a pressure typical of Category 5 hurricanes. Nonetheless, the pressure remains too high to list Opal as one of the 10 strongest Atlantic tropical cyclones. Presently, Hurricane Wilma is the strongest Atlantic hurricane ever recorded. after reaching an intensity of 882 millibars in October 2005. This also made Wilma the strongest tropical cyclone worldwide outside of the West Pacific, where 7 tropical cyclones have been recorded to intensify to lower pressures. However, this was later superseded by Hurricane Patricia in 2015 in the East Pacific, which had a pressure reading of 872 millibars. Preceding Wilma is Hurricane Gilbert, which had also held the record for most intense Atlantic hurricane for 17 years. The 1935 Labor Day hurricane, with a pressure of 892 millibars, is the third strongest Atlantic hurricane and the strongest documented tropical cyclone prior to 1950. Since the measurements taken during Wilma and Gilbert were documented using dropsonde, this pressure remains the lowest measured over land. Hurricane Rita is the fourth strongest Atlantic hurricane in terms of barometric pressure and one of 3 tropical cyclones from 2005 on the list, with the others being Wilma and Katrina at first and sixth respectively. However, with a barometric pressure of 895 millibars, Rita is the strongest tropical cyclone ever recorded in the Gulf of Mexico. Hurricanes Camille, Mitch, and Dean share intensities for the 7th strongest Atlantic hurricane at 905 millibars, sharing 10th place for most intense Atlantic tropical cyclone are Hurricane Ivan and an unnamed hurricane from 1932, which both are listed to have deepened to a pressure as low as 910 millibars. Many of the strongest recorded tropical cyclones weakened prior to their eventual landfall or demise. However, 3 of the storms remained intense enough at landfall to be considered some of the strongest landfalling hurricanes. 3 of the 11 hurricanes on the list constitute the 3 most intense Atlantic landfalls in recorded history. The 1935 Labor Day hurricane made landfall at peak intensity, making it the most intense Atlantic landfall, though it weakened slightly before its eventual landfall on the Yucatan Peninsula. Hurricane Gilbert maintained a pressure of 900 millibars at landfall, making its landfall the second strongest. Similarly, Hurricane Dean made landfall on the peninsula, though it did so at peak intensity and with a higher barometric pressure. Its landfall marked the third strongest in Atlantic hurricane history. Climatology. Climatology does serve to characterize the general properties of an average season and can be used as one of many other tools for making forecasts. Most storms form in warm waters several hundred miles north of the equator near the intertropical convergence zone from tropical waves. The Coriolis force is usually too weak to initiate sufficient rotation near the equator. Storms frequently form in the warm waters of the Gulf of Mexico, the Caribbean Sea, and the tropical Atlantic Ocean as far east as the Cape Verde Islands, the origin of strong and long-lasting Cape Verde-type hurricanes. Systems may also strengthen over the Gulf Stream off the coast of the eastern United States, wherever water temperatures exceed 26.5 degrees Celsius. Although most storms are found within tropical latitudes, occasionally storms will form further north and east from disturbances other than tropical waves such as cold fronts and upper-level lows. These are known as baroclinically induced tropical cyclones. There is a strong correlation between Atlantic hurricane activity in the tropics and the presence of an El Niño or La Niña in the Pacific Ocean. El Niño events increase the wind shear over the Atlantic, producing a less favorable environment for formation and decreasing tropical activity in the Atlantic basin. Conversely, La Niña causes an increase in activity due to a decrease in wind shear, according to the Azores High hypothesis by Cambiaulu. An anti-phase pattern is expected to exist between the Gulf of Mexico coast and the North American Atlantic coast. During the quiescent periods, a more northeasterly position of the Azores High would result in more hurricanes being steered toward the Atlantic coast. During the hyperactive period, more hurricanes were steered towards the Gulf Coast as the Azores High was shifted to a more southwesterly position near the Caribbean. Such a displacement of the Azores High is consistent with paleoclimatic evidence that shows an abrupt onset of a dry climate in Haiti around 3214 years BP, and a change towards more humid conditions in the Great Plains during the late Holocene as more moisture was pumped up the Mississippi Valley, through the Gulf Coast. Preliminary data from the northern Atlantic coast seem to support the Azores High hypothesis. A 3,000-year proxy record from a coastal lake in Cape Cod suggests that hurricane activity has increased significantly during the past 1,000 years, just as the Gulf Coast was amid a quiescent period of the last millennium. Seasonal variation. Climatologically speaking, approximately 97% of tropical cyclones that form in the North Atlantic develop between the dates of June 1 and November 30, dates which delimit the modern-day Atlantic hurricane season, though the beginning of the annual hurricane season has historically remained the same. The official end of the hurricane season has shifted from its initial date of October 31. Regardless, on average once every few years a tropical cyclone develops outside the limits of the season. As of January 2016 there have been 66 tropical cyclones in the off-season, with the most recent being Hurricane Alex in 2016. The first tropical cyclone of the 1938 Atlantic hurricane season, which formed on January 3, became the earliest forming tropical storm and hurricane after reanalysis concluded on the storm in December 2012. Hurricane Abel in 1951 was initially thought to be the earliest forming major hurricane, a tropical cyclone with winds exceeding 115 miles per hour. However, following post-storm analysis it was determined that Abel only reached Category 1 strength, which made Hurricane Alma of 1966 the new record holder, as it became a major hurricane on June 8. Though it developed within the bounds of the Atlantic hurricane season, Hurricane Audrey in 1957 became the earliest developing Category 4 hurricane on record after it reached the intensity on June 27. The earliest forming Category 5 hurricane, Emily, reached the highest intensity on the Saffir-Simpson hurricane wind scale on July 17, 2005. Though the official end of the Atlantic hurricane season occurs on November 30, the dates of October 31 and November 15 have also historically marked the official end date for the hurricane season. December, the only month of the year after the hurricane season, has featured the cyclogenesis of 14 tropical cyclones. Tropical storm Zeta in 2005 was the latest tropical cyclone to attain tropical storm intensity, as it did so on December 30. However, the second Hurricane Alice in 1954 was the latest forming tropical cyclone to attain hurricane intensity. Both Eta and Alice were the only two storms to exist in 2 calendar years, the former from 1954 to 1955 and the latter from 2005 to 2006. No storms have been recorded to exceed Category 1 hurricane intensity in December. In 1999, Hurricane Lenny reached Category 4 intensity on November 17 as it took an unprecedented west-to-east track across the Caribbean. Its intensity made it the latest developing Category 4 hurricane, though this was well within the bounds of the hurricane season. Hurricane Hattie was initially thought to have been the latest forming Category 5 hurricane ever documented, though reanalysis indicated that a devastating hurricane in 1932 reached such an intensity at a later date. Consequently, this made the hurricane the latest developing tropical cyclone to reach all four Saffir-Simpson hurricane wind scale classifications past Category 1 intensity. June, the beginning of the hurricane season, is most closely related to the timing of increases in sea surface temperatures, convective instability, and other thermodynamic factors. Although June marks the beginning of the hurricane season, generally little activity occurs during the month, with an average of one tropical cyclone every 2 years. Tropical systems usually form in the Gulf of Mexico or off the east coast of the United States. Since 1851, a total of 81 tropical storms and hurricanes formed in the month of June. During this period, 2 of these systems developed in the deep tropics east of the Lesser Antilles. Since 1870, 3 major hurricanes have formed during June, most notably Hurricane Audrey in 1957. Audrey ranks as the earliest forming Category 4 hurricane in the Atlantic Basin. Audrey attained an intensity greater than that of any Atlantic tropical cyclone during June and July until Hurricanes Dennis and Emily of 2005. The easternmost forming storm during June, Tropical Storm Anna in 1979, formed at 45 degrees west. July. Not much tropical activity occurs during the month of July, but the majority of hurricane seasons see the formation of one tropical cyclone during July. From an average of Atlantic tropical cyclone seasons from 1944 to 1996, the first tropical storm in half of the seasons occurred by the 11th of July, and a second formed by the 8th of August. Formation usually occurs in the eastern Caribbean Sea around the Lesser Antilles, in the northern and eastern parts of the Gulf of Mexico, in the vicinity of the northern Bahamas, and off the coast of the Carolinas and Virginia over the Gulf Stream. Storms travel westward through the Caribbean and then either move towards the north and curve near the eastern coast of the United States or stay on a northwestward track and enter the Gulf of Mexico. Since 1851, a total of 105 tropical storms have formed during the month of July. Since 1870, 10 of these storms reached major hurricane intensity. Only Hurricane Emily of 2005, the strongest July tropical cyclone in the Atlantic Basin, attained Category 5 hurricane status during July, making it the earliest Category 5 hurricane on record. The easternmost forming storm and longest-lived during the month of July, Hurricane Bertha in 2008, formed 22.9 degrees west and lasted 17 days. August decrease in wind shear from July to August contributes to a significant increase of tropical activity. An average of 2.8 Atlantic tropical storms develop annually in August. On average, 4 named tropical storms, including 1 hurricane, occur by August 30th, and the first intense hurricane develops by the 4th of September. September, the peak of the hurricane season, occurs in September and corresponds with low wind shear and the warmest sea surface temperatures. The month of September sees an average of 3 storms a year. By the 24th of September, the average Atlantic season features 7 named tropical storms, including 4 hurricanes. In addition, 2 major hurricanes occur on average by the 28th of September. Relatively few tropical cyclones make landfall at these intensities. October. The favorable conditions found during September begin to decay in October. The main reason for the decrease in activity is increasing wind shear, although sea surface temperatures are also cooler than in September. Activity falls markedly, with 1.8 cyclones developing on average, despite a climatological secondary peak around the 20th of October. By the 21st of October, the average season features 9 named storms with 5 hurricanes. A third major hurricane occurs after the 28th of September in half of all Atlantic tropical cyclone seasons. In contrast to mid-season activity, the mean locus of formation shifts westward to the Caribbean and Gulf of Mexico, reversing the eastward progression of June through August. November. Wind shear from westerlies increases substantially through November, generally preventing cyclone formation. On average, one tropical storm forms during every other November. On rare occasions, a major hurricane occurs. The few intense hurricanes in November include Hurricane Cuba in late October and early November 1932, Hurricane Lenny in mid-November 1999, Hurricane Kate in late November 1985, and Hurricane Paloma in early November 2008. December to May. Although the hurricane season is defined as beginning on June 1st and ending on November 30th, there have been several off-season storms. Since 1870, there have been 32 off-season cyclones, 18 of which occurred in May. In the same time span, 9 storms formed in December, 2 in April, and 1 each in January, February and March. During 5 years, tropical cyclones formed in the North Atlantic Ocean both during or before May and during December. In 1887, 4 storms occurred outside the season, the most in a single year. High vertical wind shear and low sea surface temperatures generally preclude tropical cyclone formation during the off-season. Tropical cyclones have formed in all months. 4 tropical cyclones existed during the month of January, 2 of which formed during late December. The second Hurricane Alice in 1954-1955, and Tropical Storm Zeta in 2005-2006. The only 2 hurricanes to form in January are a Category 1 hurricane in the 1938 season, and Hurricane Alex in the 2016 season. A subtropical storm in January also began the 1978 Atlantic hurricane season. No major hurricanes have occurred in the off-season. Extremes. The season in which the most tropical storms formed on record was the 2005 Atlantic hurricane season. That season was also the one in which the most hurricanes formed on record. The 2005 Atlantic hurricane season had the most major hurricanes on record. The 1950 Atlantic hurricane season was once thought to have 8, but a reanalysis showed that several storms were weaker than thought, and thus the record is now held by the 2005 season. The least active season on record since 1946 was the 1983 Atlantic hurricane season, with 1 tropical storm, 2 hurricanes, and 1 major hurricane. Overall, the 1914 Atlantic hurricane season remains the least active, with only 1 documented storm. The most intense hurricane on record to form in the North Atlantic basin was Hurricane Wilma. The largest hurricane on record to form in the North Atlantic was Hurricane Sandy, with a gale diameter of 1,100 miles. The longest-lasting hurricane was the San Ciriacos hurricane of 1899, which lasted for 27 days and 18 hours as a tropical cyclone. The longest-tracked hurricane was Hurricane Faith, which traveled for 6,850 miles as a tropical cyclone. Faith is also the northernmost moving tropical cyclone in the Atlantic basin. The most tornadoes spawned by a hurricane was 127 by Hurricane Ivan. The strongest landfalling hurricane was the Labor Day hurricane of 1935. The deadliest hurricane was the Great Hurricane of 1780, the deadliest hurricane to make landfall on the continental United States was the Galveston hurricane in 1900, which may have killed up to 12,000 people. The most damaging hurricane was Hurricane Katrina of the 2005 season, which caused $108 billion in damages. The quickest forming hurricane was Hurricane Humberto in 2007. It was a minimal hurricane that formed and intensified faster than any other tropical cyclone on record before landfall. Developing on September 12, 2007, in the northwestern Gulf of Mexico, the cyclone rapidly strengthened and struck High Island, Texas, with winds of about 90 miles per hour early on September 13.